Also the Arboricultural Association itself. And the two organisations merged, and at that time we had one united voice for British arboriculture. Sadly, that's not the case at the moment, but we're working on bringing it back together in some meaningful way. You know, we've got so many different organisations, and this is a little hobby horse of mine, as you probably know, that we need to kind of, you know, speak together and work together more. And I'm really pleased to say that's starting to happen. But the Arboricultural Association Journal started, first edition there, May '65. The great Dr. Tom Hall was largely responsible for putting that on the map as a respected arboricultural journal. There's a whole section in a whole chapter in the book on governance. And we're looking at, you know, how from the earliest days it might have been the monarch or major aristocrats who influenced you know, the introduction of trees into urban areas, and what sort of say, usually no say, that ordinary working people had in terms of trees in the urban environment, and the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the fact that at that time working people, generally speaking, didn't even have a garden, and it was extremely grim. And we look at the rise of local authorities, the rise of the voluntary sector, a whole sort of topic of governance and how people have tried to have some influence over the nature of the urban treescape. And in terms of laws and statutes that have been passed, this is, I think, from 1879. This is the city of Cardiff, a poster warning people about the you know, destruction of trees and trees in urban areas. Also, the various threats to trees. Some of you may be familiar with the textbook of Diseases of Trees by Robert Hartig. Not just a hugely important work in terms of trees and diseases, but one of the great works of science, actually, in any discipline. Finally published in English in 1894. And we look at all the kind of other threats to trees, including vandalism and what I might describe as casual vandalism. I took that photo when I first became a tree officer in London, and I didn't set it up, that's exactly how I saw it. And people using the tree guard as a litter bin. You can tell by the age of the cars it wasn't recent. But then we look at the whole history of trees in private gardens, bearing in mind that most working people didn't have a garden as such until fairly recently, and if they did have any sort of plots, they were generally speaking, you know, given over to growing vegetables and more like small holdings. But it was the sort of the landed aristocracy and ruling class that more had the gardens. But I've taken this illustration from, again, William Lawson, New Orchard and Garden, first edition, 1618, and showing his sort of ideal garden. But you'll see in the book how many of these elements actually depend on trees or include trees in the design. Then the introduction of private residential squares. We kind of take for granted now that, you know, many of those squares in our major cities, London, Edinburgh, Bath, places like that, are actually now public open spaces, but they actually started life as private residential gardens, owned and enjoyed by the people whose properties overlook them. And this is actually Red Lion Square, around about 1800, just before its formal kind of landscape was about to be re-landscaped into more of a kind of picturesque landscape arrangement. But originally most of those squares were quite a formal landscape arrangement. And then the rise of the suburban villa. Those people who had the money and the ability to get out of the centre of London and relocate their families to the fast expanding suburbs and build their own little private villas and plant trees and live in, quite comfortable and pleasant surroundings. Again, Loudon in his Suburban Gardener and Villa Companion, 1838, actually classifies gardens as first, second and third rate. This is actually a third rate garden, at the bottom end of the scale. So you can imagine, what the first rate gardens were like. But at least it was looking at, the introduction of trees into the suburban landscape. And then we look at the origins of public open space, the origins of public walks, promenades, which were the sort of kind of forerunners of both public parks and street trees in many respects as well. This is the public walk at St James's Palace by the Park, around about 1800, but it actually dates back much earlier than that. I'm fascinated by the pleasure gardens. I don't know if I'm sure quite a few of you are aware that the forerunners of our public parks were these areas called the pleasure gardens, and they're quite different in the sense that they were only open in the summertime. They charged for admission, but anybody who was suitably dressed or relatively well behaved could actually get in and enjoy these places. And they were full of entertainments, very colourful. Also, some of the larger gardens had quite a wonderful nightlife as well. And this is the famous Vauxhall Gardens, taken around 1751. But what you can see is the enormous reliance on trees in terms of the gardens. They weren't just in London either. Pleasure gardens were usually at least one in every major town and city in Britain. But London had a predominance of them, and much of what we know of the pleasure gardens comes from Warwick Roth, who wrote much of the history of it, but he only wrote about the London gardens. And this is Ranelagh Gardens in 1754, people all dressed up in costume. This was more for the sort of the well-heeled middle classes, really, because they did charge for admission. It wasn't always that easy to get to. So although, we shouldn't get too carried away that these were, totally inclusive public spaces, because people were kind of filtered out into the in the more prestige pleasure gardens by virtue of the fact that it was expensive to get to some of them, and also to dress up, to afford to dress up and actually get in. And then, of course, the rise of the Victorian public parks. One of the difficulties I had in writing this book was not to just write another history of public parks, open spaces and that sort of thing, and to actually focus on the trees. So that's what I've tried to do in this, But you do need to give some of the context by talking about the history of public parks and such like. And you'll probably recognise that's Birkenhead Park, opened in 1847, one of the first public parks in Britain. And then a whole chapter on street trees. I'm absolutely fascinated by the history of street trees in Britain. That's my next book coming up. I'm actually focusing now on the history of street trees particularly. This is an engraving from William Robinson's book, The Parks, Promenades and Gardens of Paris. He was inspired when he went over and saw what was happening in France and Paris in particular, and came back to Britain and said, we do need this here in our country, the kind of the boulevards that were being put through Paris by Baron Haussmann for Napoleon III, and remarkable, and still are an absolutely wonderful legacy of street trees in Paris. And of course, we started to develop similar efforts here in Britain. The Victoria Embankment was one of the first kind of street tree plantings in London. One of the things we may be not aware of or tend to forget is actually how recent street tree planting is. You can go back and there are early examples of what we could call street tree planting, but in terms of the systematic planting of trees in our streets, it only really dates from the late 1900s. the late 1800s, the late 19th century. It's all quite recent. And some of them are still, contributing to our urban landscape, particularly the Edwardian plantings, planes and limes, but they do bring with them various management challenges as well. Then there's a whole section of the book that deals with trees in other kind of open spaces, and we look at cemeteries. And again, John Claudius Loudon wrote almost the Bible on the planting and laying out of the landscape of cemeteries. And this was the earliest attempts to plant up the landscape with what was called the pleasure ground approach. It was more like the landscape of Humphrey Repton and Capability Brown. But John Claudius Loudon had his own ideas and introduced the gardenesque approach, which was a rather different approach to the landscape, and that kind of became standard. And then we look at trees in a whole range of other open spaces. This is the golf course, Edgbaston Golf Course, a former Capability Brown landscape that's now been transformed into a private golf course, but of wonderful old chestnut trees that are standing on the course. We look at trees in schools and university grounds in urban areas, also hospitals, particularly the old psychiatric asylums, the mental hospitals, urban botanic gardens, urban churchyards, also seaside resorts, and a little bit on roof gardens as well. And we conclude the book by a chapter which I've entitled Visions of Urban Green. And this is looking at the efforts that have been made, certainly from the late 1700s onwards, in terms to create ideal urban settlements and the model villages and the model towns, and then on to the garden cities and the new towns. And this is Saltaire, Titus Salt, near Bradford, created an industrial village between 1848 and 1868. And an attempt to provide his workers with something of a relatively nice green environment. And he had a whole series of allotments in front of the mill that could be used by workers. And many of them actually planted up with fruit trees in a sort of orchard-like appearance. And then, of course, Ebenezer Howard, his remarkable book, popularly known as Garden Cities of Tomorrow, 1898, on which we've developed the garden cities and the new towns, and how trees have been introduced into the urban landscape in all sorts of imaginative ways. So I've condensed that into a very short space of time. There are 8 chapters in the book, nearly 300 pages. I hope you'll get some enjoyment out of reading it, and hopefully it's a contribution to the literature in terms of the history of British urban arboriculture. And I'd be very keen to hear from people, particularly on the topic of street trees. Now we're looking at the history of street trees. So if you've got any sort of information that you could share with me, particularly interesting and early examples of street tree plantings that you're aware of, or something of significance, doesn't have to be really old, it can be still fairly recent, but of something of interest, I'd be very pleased to hear from you. And as I say, we do have copies of that book available here today. So really, thank you very much for your attention. That's my email address, no longer Myerscough College, that's my private email address. I'd be really keen to hear from you. Thank you very much. Well, that brings me to our next speaker, Kenton Rogers. Kenton has worked in the industry since leaving school. He has a master's in forest ecosystem management, for which he focused on the urban forest ecosystem. Kenton recently won a place on the School of Social Entrepreneurs Fellowship Programme, which enabled him to develop treeconomics. I'm sure you've all heard of treeconomics, and you certainly will now. We will hear much about treeconomics in the future, I'm sure. It's a social enterprise which Kenton co-founded. Kenton has been a trustee of the International Tree Foundation for the past 10 years. He's a chartered forester and fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kenton Rogers.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for the introduction, Mark, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to be briefly talking about the London Relief iTree Eco project that was completed last year, all the field work, and the implications for urban forest management. And I'm here from Treeconomics, and our involvement in that project was to get involved and help with the training, advice, and the interpretation of results. And the reason for that was based on our experience in doing the collaborative pilot project where we road tested iTree Eco in Torbay in 2011. Now, the other thing to mention is I wasn't supposed to be here originally. I was going to be out there with you, and I'm covering this talk for Jim Smith from the Forestry Commission, and he was on the original billing, but unfortunately, and for very good reasons, he can't be with us today, and that's a bit of a shame really, because Jim was one of the original instigators of this London project, bringing together all these wonderful organisations to work together and complete the work. So people from Giggle, who did a lot of the mapping stuff, the Tree Council and Trees for Cities, who provided volunteers, the London Tree Officers Association, who provided a lot of the professional people to help the volunteers, as well as a lot of other stuff as well, and the Mayor of London's office, Natural England, Forest Research, and of course the USDA Forest Service and Davey in the States, who helped process and look at the data. I hope to God I haven't forgotten anyone. So, what is iTree? And I'm sure Dave Noack will go into this in a bit more detail later, but just briefly, iTree is a computer model, and it's a software suite that allows us to look at the urban forest. iTree Eco in particular allows us to look at the structure of that resource, the tree species, their sizes, and also the range of benefits or functions that they provide, and from that we can value those functions, as well as look at the estimated replacement cost of each tree or the collective urban forest as it exists in the landscape as well. So this computer model is based on over 20 years of peer-reviewed research, coupled with very large databases and a whole range of user interfaces, but there's two of which that we can use in the UK. iTree Canopy, which gives us a top-down approach based on aerial imagery, gives us a very quick estimate of canopy cover and where we could plant new trees, and a bottom-up approach that's provided with the iTree Eco tool, and that means people have to get out into the field and measure the trees. It's more time-consuming, but it's what we did for the London project, getting all that information on the tree resource. The models are free to use, and they're open source, and there are many collaborators in the US working on the iTree program, namely the USDA Forest Service and Davey, but there are others like Casey Trees and the Arbor Day Foundation. In the UK, we signed an MOU with Forest Research and the Arboricultural Association to help with disseminating information and providing greater access and usability within a UK context with the guys in the States as well. So who's using iTree in the UK? Local authorities, from the pilot in 2011 in Torbay through to projects with Forest Research in Glasgow, Wrexham and Edinburgh, but also complete inventory, smaller, more discrete projects within London itself. This example from the Victoria Business Improvement District, and also large public owning land agencies like the Highways Agency, so that's a recently completed report, but also community groups and developers. For example, there's a group in Devon, the Sidmouth Arboretum Group. They're just currently looking at their data and beginning to shape up their report. Quite wonderfully, they haven't got an arboretum in Sidmouth, so they've declared the whole town an arboretum. And they're using iTree Eco to inform their decisions going forward. What have they got? That's all very interesting, but what about London? So, whilst ecosystem service valuation, and it doesn't roll off the tongue, but as a specific term or methodology, that's only arisen in recent years, following there's a great paper by a chap called Costanza, and from that came the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and after that we had our National Ecosystem Assessment. But the value of open space, including the urban forest as well, that's been recognised for decades or centuries, even longer. And this is especially so in London because at one point it was really bad there. And this is a painting from 1851 by Lloyds, although I think it shows an earlier period, and it's from Southwark Bridge looking out towards St Paul's Cathedral. There's a lot of smog there, it's very dense, and there are hardly any trees. In fact, there's only one tree. And the only reason that tree was there, we believe, was to hang people from. As an ecosystem service, that's debatable. So moving on, after the Second World War, London went through a period of rapid expansion and development, and so the Abercrombie Plan highlighted the value of open space during that period, and it identified a whole concept of networked parkways, green corridors that contiguously weave their way through London. And unfortunately, though, only two of those, Lee Valley and Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, they're probably the only two that have been realised from that. More recently, Boris Johnston, the Mayor, set a clear aim for London, and that's proved extremely helpful, actually, in galvanising momentum, as he wants to see an increase in tree canopy cover by 5% by 2025 and a further 5% by 2050. And that commitment was given alongside new funding for street trees and other green space improvements as well. But what to plant and where? And what actually is London's tree canopy cover? How does it compare to the rest of the UK? Well, it's pretty good, actually. There's been a few studies now, just in London, and the latest one is the LTOA canopy survey, so it's around 22%. But how does it compare to the rest of Europe? Well, then the picture changes slightly, but we are looking more at forests here. So the size of the circle shows the size of the study area. But it's just to illustrate, really, that that canopy cover is important. And this actually just looks particularly at trees and woodlands. But when we look more at the other green space that we have, the parks and those garden squares, we still think that London's probably one of the greenest cities in the world. Thanks to that Victorian legacy, the Victorians embarked upon a lot of tree planting because it got so bad in London. And there's also areas of woodland as well in Greater London. And that's located in the outer boroughs. But it doesn't mean that inner London is bereft of trees, because we have things like the Royal Parks, those street trees, City of London green space, and those garden squares. But there's still an awful lot we don't know about London's urban forests. Or London's urban forest, excuse me. But that's until now, because with this Relief London iTree Eco project,